Adia had never known the warmth of a loving family. Since the death of her parents, she had been left in the care of her father's brother and his wife, people who saw her not as a child to be nurtured, but as an unwanted burden. They lived in a small village on the edge of a vast and ancient forest, a place where the trees whispered secrets in the wind, where the ground was thick with roots that told stories of the past. The village depended on the land for survival, farming, fishing, and hunting, but in recent years, life had grown difficult. The rains no longer came when they were expected, the river that once ran strong had begun to shrink, and the crops wilted under the harsh sun. Hunger had become a constant companion to the people, and whispers of misfortune spread like wildfire. In times of hardship, it was easy to blame those who could not defend themselves. Adia, with her thin frame and tattered clothes, became the perfect scapegoat. Her uncle, a man hardened by labor and disappointment, often grumbled that ever since she had come to live with them, nothing had gone right. His wife, who had never hidden her resentment for the girl, was harsher in her words. She would spit on the ground whenever Adia passed, muttering curses under her breath. "She is a mouth we cannot afford to feed," the woman would say, shaking her head as she kneaded the little flour they had left into a miserable, thin dough. "Why should we suffer for a child that is not ours?" And so, Adia became their servant. From dawn to dusk, she toiled, fetching water from the distant well, gathering firewood, washing clothes by the river, and scrubbing the mud-packed floors of their hut. Her hands, once soft, were now rough with blisters. Her feet, cracked from walking barefoot over stones and thorns, bled with every step. But the worst pain was the gnawing hunger that never left her. While her uncle and aunt sat down to eat, she would be given scraps, chewed bones with no meat left, stale porridge, and sometimes, nothing at all. She learned not to complain, for if she did, she would be met with a hard slap or a cruel shove. The other children in the village were no kinder. They saw how her own family treated her and took it as permission to do the same. They pulled at her hair, mocked her ragged dress, and called her names: ghost girl, bad luck child, the cursed one. When she walked by, they made the sign of protection against evil, as if she carried a sickness they feared would spread. But Adia was not sick. She was simply alone. The village itself was changing, as desperation took hold of its people. The old men who once sat beneath the baobab tree telling stories of their youth now sat in silence, their bellies empty. The women, who used to sing as they pounded grain, now barely spoke, their voices heavy with worry. The chief, a man known for his wisdom, had called meetings to discuss the village's future, but no solution had been found. Some had begun to whisper about leaving, seeking a new home beyond the river, though no one knew if such a place existed. One night, as Adia lay curled on the floor of her uncle's hut, trying to ignore the hunger twisting in her stomach, she overheard them speaking in hushed tones. "She is the reason for all of this," her aunt hissed. "Ever since she arrived, our luck has turned." "She is just a child," her uncle replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "A cursed child," the woman snapped. "The gods are punishing us for keeping her. If we want to survive, we must do something." A heavy silence followed. Adia held her breath, pressing her fingers against the woven mat beneath her. She knew, deep in her heart, that whatever they were planning, it would not end well for her. "We must take her into the forest," her aunt continued, her voice softer now, as if soothing a wild animal. "Leave her there. The spirits will take her, and our troubles will end." Her uncle grunted, neither agreeing nor refusing. Adia's heart pounded so loudly she feared they would hear it. The forest was vast and filled with dangers, wild beasts, venomous snakes, and things even worse that lurked in the shadows. No one who wandered too far into its depths ever returned. The village told stories of spirits that snatched children, of trees that swallowed the lost, of voices that led travelers astray. She wanted to believe it was just a threat, that when morning came, she would wake up and nothing would have changed. But she knew better. She had seen the look in her aunt's eyes, the kind of look that did not waver. The darkness of the hut pressed around her, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood fear. At dawn, Adia was shaken awake by her aunt's rough hands. The woman loomed over her, her face cast in the dim light filtering through the hut's thatched roof. "Get up," she snapped. "We're going to the forest to gather wood." Adia sat up quickly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. Her body ached from the hard ground, but she dared not complain. If they were gathering wood, it meant she would be allowed outside the village, a rare moment of escape from her endless chores. She nodded silently and pulled her tattered shawl over her shoulders. Outside, the sky was still painted in hues of deep blue and purple, the sun barely beginning its ascent. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant fires. Her uncle stood by the entrance of their hut, holding a small woven basket. He did not meet her gaze. They set off soon after, walking past the waking village. A few people glanced their way, but no one said anything. They moved beyond the last row of mud huts, past the grazing lands where thin cattle wandered, and toward the edge of the forest. Adia had been in the forest many times before, though never too deep. The villagers spoke of things that lived beyond the well-trodden paths, spirits, beasts, and unseen forces that swallowed the lost. She had always been warned never to stray too far, to always keep the village within sight. Today, however, they walked past the familiar clearings and into the unknown. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps they were searching for better firewood, for the drought had left the trees near the village brittle and useless. But as they continued walking, the path became less familiar. The trees grew taller and denser, their thick canopies swallowing the sunlight. A strange silence settled over them, broken only by the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Her heart began to pound. She glanced at her aunt, who walked ahead without looking back. Her uncle followed close behind, his steps heavy and deliberate. Something was wrong. "Auntie," she said hesitantly, "we are going very far today." Her voice was small, almost lost in the vastness of the trees. Her aunt did not respond. "Auntie," she tried again. Still, there was silence. Fear crept up her spine, cold and unrelenting. She turned to her uncle, who had been walking just behind her. But when she looked, he was gone. Adia spun around wildly. He had been there a moment ago. She was sure of it. Her breathing quickened as she turned back toward her aunt. But her aunt, too, had vanished. Panic gripped her. She ran forward, pushing past ferns and branches, calling their names. There was no reply. Only the stillness of the forest, the towering trees, the endless shadows stretching in every direction. She ran back the way she thought they had come, but the path had disappeared. There was no sign of footsteps, no broken twigs, no familiar landmarks. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole. Her knees weakened, and she stumbled, gasping for breath. They had left her. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. They had planned this. They had led her deep into the forest and disappeared, knowing she would never find her way back. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She could not cry. Crying would not bring them back. Crying would not help her survive. She sat down on a fallen log, hugging her arms around herself. They would come back. They had to. Maybe they were playing a cruel trick, testing her. Maybe if she waited long enough, they would return. Minutes passed. Then hours. The sun climbed higher in the sky, then began its slow descent. The warmth of the day faded, and a chill settled over the forest. They were not coming back. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder of her hunger. She had eaten nothing that morning. She scanned her surroundings, searching for something, anything, that could sustain her. She remembered what little her mother had taught her before she died. Certain leaves could be boiled into a bitter but edible stew. Some berries were safe to eat, while others were deadly. But the forest was vast, and she had no fire, no pot, no way of cooking even if she found something. Night fell quickly, the shadows stretching longer until the entire world was drenched in darkness. The sounds of the forest changed. Where there had once been birdsong and rustling leaves, there were now unfamiliar noises, low growls, distant howls, the snap of twigs underfoot. Adia huddled against the base of a tree, wrapping her arms around her knees. She could not see beyond a few feet in front of her. The darkness pressed in from all sides, alive and whispering. Something moved nearby. A rustling, slow and deliberate. She held her breath. Another sound, closer this time. A low snarl. Her heart pounded. She had no weapons, no way to defend herself. If something found her, if something came for her, she would not stand a chance. She scrambled to her feet and climbed the nearest tree, her fingers grasping at rough bark, her feet slipping against the trunk. She was weak from hunger, but fear gave her strength. She climbed as high as she could, pressing herself against a thick branch. Below, something moved through the underbrush. She could not see it, but she could hear it. Slow, deliberate steps. A sniffing sound. It waited for a long time before it finally left. Adia stayed in the tree, shivering, her stomach aching, her limbs trembling from exhaustion. She was alone. She did not know which way to go. She did not know how to get back. And she knew, in her heart, that she could not rely on anyone but herself. The night was endless. Adia remained in the tree, pressed against the rough bark, too afraid to move. Sleep was impossible. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every snap of a twig, sent waves of fear through her. The darkness was alive with unseen creatures, their eyes glowing like embers in the distance. She clutched her knees to her chest, willing herself to disappear, to become part of the tree itself. At some point, exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into a restless slumber, waking only when the first rays of sunlight pierced through the canopy. The forest was different in the morning. The terror of the night faded slightly, replaced by a new urgency, hunger, thirst, and the need to survive. Her stomach ached, and her lips were dry. She could not afford to sit and wait for a miracle. She needed water. Adia closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. Before her mother had died, she had taught her small things, things that now felt like treasures buried deep in her memory. Water always flows downward, she had said. If you follow the land, it will lead you to a stream. Using the morning light to guide her, Adia searched for slopes in the land. She walked carefully, stepping over roots and fallen branches, ears attuned to every sound. The forest was waking up. Birds called to one another in shrill cries, insects buzzed in the damp undergrowth, and small creatures scurried through the leaves. Then, she heard it. A faint trickling sound. Hope surged in her chest. She moved faster, pushing past the thick brush until she reached a small stream. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, reflecting the sky above. Relief overwhelmed her. She knelt by the bank, hesitating. Her mother had warned her never to drink from still water, it could be dangerous. But moving water, running over rocks, was safer. She cupped her hands and brought the cool liquid to her lips, drinking deeply. The dryness in her throat eased, and for the first time since she had been abandoned, she felt a sliver of strength returning. Now, food. She scanned the bushes around her, searching for something familiar. Small red berries clustered on a nearby shrub, their color vibrant against the deep green leaves. They looked tempting, but she hesitated. Her mother had told her stories of poisonous fruits, of children who ate the wrong berries and never woke up again. She looked closer. The leaves had a distinct shape, oval with jagged edges. She touched the berries gently, rolling one between her fingers. Then she remembered something important: animals. If birds and monkeys ate from a plant, it was likely safe. She waited, watching the tree above her. A few moments later, a small bird landed on a branch, pecking at the berries before flying away. Relief flooded her. She picked a handful and ate slowly, letting the tart sweetness spread across her tongue. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The day passed in cautious exploration. She kept close to the stream, following it further, always watching for danger. The forest was vast, and she was small, but she was learning. She noticed which plants had sharp thorns, which vines dripped with sap that made her fingers tingle, in which mushrooms seemed untouched, even by insects. When night began to fall, fear crept back in. She needed shelter. The thought of spending another night exposed on the ground terrified her. As she searched, she came across an enormous tree, its roots thick and gnarled, creating a small hollow at its base. It was not much, but it was a place to hide. She crawled inside, curling up beneath the twisted roots. The scent of damp earth surrounded her, and though her body ached from exhaustion, she could not rest easily. The night sounds returned, the distant cries of hunting animals, the rustling of unseen things. Then, a new sound. Low, guttural laughter. Her blood froze. A hyena. She had seen them before near the village, scavengers that fed on anything they could find. But here, in the depths of the forest, she was alone. If it found her, she had no one to protect her. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. The hyena sniffed the air, its heavy breathing carrying in the silence. Adia remained as still as possible, barely daring to breathe. The beast stepped closer, its large head tilting as it scanned the darkness. Adia knew she had seconds to act. Summoning the last of her strength, she bolted from the roots, running toward the nearest tree. The hyena let out a sharp bark and lunged after her, but she was faster. Her fingers found purchase on the rough bark, and she scrambled up, her feet slipping as she climbed higher and higher. The hyena circled below, growling in frustration. It paced back and forth, watching her with hungry eyes. But it could not climb. She pressed herself against the trunk, heart racing, waiting. It stayed for what felt like hours before finally losing interest and slinking back into the darkness. Adia remained in the tree, clinging to the branch until the night was nearly over. She had survived. And with each passing day, she learned more. She learned how to listen to the sounds of the forest, the different cries of birds, the rustling patterns of animals moving through the undergrowth. She learned to avoid the bushes with waxy leaves, to watch the ground for tracks, to recognize which parts of the stream were shallow enough to cross without getting caught in the current. She was no longer just a lost girl. She was learning to belong to the wild. Adia had grown used to the loneliness of the forest. Each day, she moved with caution, listening to the rhythm of nature, blending into its embrace. The nights were still terrifying, but she had learned how to hide, how to stay out of sight, how to read the language of the wild. Yet, despite her growing resilience, she still longed for something more, human warmth, a voice other than her own, a sign that she was not completely forgotten. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the forest was bathed in deep orange light, she caught sight of something unusual. A flickering glow. Fire. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen no one for days. The forest had been hers alone. But now, just beyond a cluster of thick trees, a fire burned, its golden flames licking at the twilight sky. Adia crept forward, her heart pounding. Was it a traveler? A lost villager? Someone who could take her home? As she approached, she saw her. An old woman sat by the fire, wrapped in a cloak the color of midnight. Her face was hidden beneath the hood, but her hands, thin, wrinkled, lined with years of wisdom, moved gracefully as she stirred something in a small clay pot. The scent of herbs and smoke filled the air. Adia hesitated. The woman did not look dangerous, but there was something strange about her. Something otherworldly. The forest was full of spirits, and not all of them were kind. Before she could turn away, the woman lifted her head. Her eyes, dark and deep as the night sky, locked onto Adia. "You have been watching for some time," the woman said, her voice soft, yet powerful. "Come closer, child." Adia swallowed hard. There was no threat in the woman's tone, only quiet curiosity. Slowly, she stepped forward, her bare feet brushing against the cool earth. The woman tilted her head, studying her. "You are far from where you belong." Adia nodded. "I was left here." Her voice was small, uncertain. The woman stirred her pot again. "And yet, you survive." Adia did not know how to respond. She glanced at the pot, at the small bundle of leaves and roots beside the fire. Her stomach tightened. The berries she had eaten earlier were long gone, and she had found little else that day. The woman noticed her gaze and smiled. "Are you hungry?" Adia hesitated but then nodded. The woman lifted a small wooden bowl and handed it to her. The liquid inside was thick, dark, and smelled of strange herbs. Adia took the bowl but did not drink. She had been taught to never accept food from strangers, especially in the forest. The woman chuckled, as if reading her thoughts. "Cautious. That is good. But tell me, child, what food do you carry?" Adia looked down at the small bundle in her hands, just a few pieces of edible roots she had gathered earlier. It was hardly enough to fill her, let alone share. The woman held out her hand. "Will you give me some?" Adia hesitated. It was all she had. But something inside her whispered, a soft, familiar voice, reminding her of the lessons her mother had once told her. Kindness, even in hardship, is never wasted. With a deep breath, she placed half of what she had in the woman's open palm. The old woman smiled. "Even when you have little, you give. This is rare." She closed her fingers around the offering and, as Adia watched, something incredible happened. The air around them shimmered, like heat rising from the ground. The fire flickered strangely, its flames turning from orange to deep blue. The woman's form seemed to shift, growing taller, stronger. When she lifted her hood, her face was no longer that of a frail old woman but something radiant, something powerful. Adia gasped. "You are no ordinary traveler," she whispered. The woman laughed, and the sound was like rustling leaves, like the whisper of wind through ancient trees. "I am not. I am the spirit who watches over this forest. I have walked these lands long before your people built their villages. And I have seen many who have been tested." Adia trembled, unsure whether to bow, to run, or to speak. The woman, no, the spirit, gazed at her with something like pride. "Kindness in darkness brings light," she murmured. "You have proven your heart." Then, she reached into the folds of her cloak and pulled something out. A small, glowing stone, no larger than a pebble, nestled in her palm. It pulsed with a soft, golden light, like the last breath of the setting sun. "This is my gift to you," the spirit said, pressing the stone into Adia's hand. Adia shivered as warmth spread through her fingers, traveling up her arm, filling her chest with something she could not explain. Power, but also peace. "What does it do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The spirit's eyes twinkled. "That is for you to discover." Adia clutched the stone, feeling its warmth against her skin. She could sense something awakening inside her, an understanding, a connection. The rustling leaves around her seemed clearer, the distant call of birds almost like whispers of words she could nearly understand. The spirit stepped back, her form beginning to fade into the mist. "You are not alone, child. Spirits walk beside you, watching, guiding. Trust yourself." Adia wanted to ask more, wanted to understand, but before she could speak, the spirit dissolved into the evening mist, leaving nothing behind but the dying embers of the fire. She stood there for a long time, staring at the place where the woman had been. The forest around her felt different now, less like a place of danger and more like something alive, something watching over her. She looked down at the stone in her hand, its glow flickering softly. She was no longer just a lost girl. She had been chosen. And for the first time since she had been abandoned, she felt something new stirring inside her. Hope. The forest no longer felt like an enemy. It spoke to Adia now, not in words, but in whispers through the wind, in the rustling of the leaves, in the distant cries of birds. She had always feared this place, but now she moved through it with a strange sense of belonging. The glowing stone in her palm pulsed gently, guiding her, though she did not yet understand how. Days passed, though she had stopped counting. Each morning, she woke with renewed strength, her senses sharper, her steps lighter. She no longer wandered aimlessly. The stone seemed to respond whenever she held it, a warm pulse whenever she chose the right path, a slight coolness when she strayed. Then, one evening, she saw it. A break in the dense trees. She hesitated, then pushed forward. As she stepped through the foliage, the world seemed to change. The air smelled different, richer, filled with something ancient. The trees here were taller, their trunks wide and gnarled with age. The ground was smooth, as if the land had been cared for. And in the distance, nestled between towering cliffs, lay something impossible. A village. Adia's breath caught. It was unlike any place she had ever seen. The homes were made of woven vines and smooth stone, blending seamlessly with the landscape. Lanterns, glowing with a soft golden light, hung from the trees, casting a warm glow over the village. People moved gracefully, their clothes embroidered with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the fading light. She took a step forward, unsure if she was dreaming. A voice called out. "You have arrived." Adia turned to see a group of people standing before her. The elders, their faces lined with wisdom, their eyes filled with knowing. Among them were children, women, men, all watching her with quiet curiosity. One of the elders stepped forward, an old man with silver hair braided down his back. "We have been waiting for you." Adia's heart pounded. "Me?" He nodded. "You carry the stone. The sign of the one who was foretold." A woman, her skin the color of the deep earth, stepped closer. "Long ago, there was a prophecy. That in a time of great darkness, a girl would come from beyond the trees, carrying the light of the spirits. She would restore the balance that had been lost." Adia clutched the stone tighter. "But I am just a girl. I was left to die." The elder's gaze was steady. "You were left because the world did not yet see your worth. But the spirits did." Adia did not know what to say. She had spent so long feeling unwanted, abandoned, forgotten. But here, these people, these strangers, spoke as if she was something more. The village welcomed her as if she had always belonged. She was given food, a place to rest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. But safety was not why she was here. The elders began to teach her. They showed her how to sharpen her instincts, how to read the forest like a map. She learned how to track footprints, how to listen to the trees and know when danger was near. She trained in strength, in patience, in wisdom. Most importantly, she learned about her gift. The stone was not just a symbol, it was power. It connected her to the unseen forces of the land. When she held it, she could hear the whispers of nature more clearly. She could sense the presence of things beyond the physical world. She could feel the heartbeat of the forest itself. She grew stronger. She grew wiser. And with time, she understood. She could not stay here forever. She had been given this gift for a reason. She had survived for a reason. And one day, she would have to return. Not as the abandoned girl, but as something more. Adia stood at the edge of the hidden village, her heart pounding as she prepared for the journey ahead. She had come to know this place as home, but it was not where she was meant to stay. Her path led back to the people who had abandoned her, to the place where she had once been powerless. She was not powerless anymore. With the stone pulsing gently in her palm, she stepped into the forest once more. The elders had warned her that the journey back would not be easy. The land would test her, just as it had before, but this time, she would not be the frightened girl who had been left to die. The trials of the journey. Her first great challenge came quickly. A river, wide and rushing, blocked her path. Its waters roared, deep and fast, with no bridge in sight. The current could easily sweep her away. She searched for another way around, but the forest was thick, the terrain treacherous. There was no choice, she had to cross. She knelt by the edge, gripping the glowing stone tightly. Closing her eyes, she listened, not to the river's rage, but to its rhythm, its voice. The water was wild, but it was not her enemy. She stepped forward, placing her trust in the stone's warmth. As she moved, the current seemed to shift, no longer fighting against her but guiding her steps. She waded carefully, the icy water rising to her waist, then her chest. Her breath was steady, her mind calm. With one final push, she reached the other side, collapsing onto the riverbank. She had passed the first test. The trickster's spirit. As the days passed, the forest grew denser, the trees whispering secrets she could almost understand. She was not alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she heard laughter. A child's laughter. She turned sharply. A boy stood before her, grinning. His eyes shimmered like the surface of a lake, his movements too fluid, too quick. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice light, playful. Adia knew better than to answer quickly. The forest was full of spirits, some kind, some dangerous. She studied him carefully. He looked human, but his feet hovered slightly above the ground. His smile was too wide, his presence too sudden. A trickster. "I know the way home," the boy said, tilting his head. "I can take you there." Adia remained still, remembering the old woman's words, "Kindness in darkness brings light." She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small piece of food. "Would you like some?" she asked gently. The trickster's grin faltered. He had expected fear, suspicion, but not kindness. He hesitated, then took the offering, sniffing it curiously. "You are different," he murmured. Adia smiled. "I have learned." The trickster let out a laugh, but this time, it was genuine. "Very well. No tricks tonight." He waved a hand, and the path ahead cleared, the trees shifting aside to reveal a way forward. "Go, then," he said, vanishing into the mist. Adia exhaled in relief. The second test was done. The final steps. For days, she pressed on, through forests and valleys, up steep hills and across rocky plains. She walked through storms, through cold, through exhaustion. The stone never let her falter, its glow reminding her of all she had overcome. And then, one morning, she saw it. Her village. The place she had once called home. But it was not as she had left it. The air was heavy with sorrow. The fields were dry, the river lower than before. The once lively market stood quiet, the people moving with weary steps. The village that had cast her out was suffering. She took a deep breath, stepping forward. She had returned. But now, the girl they had abandoned was no longer the same. As Adia stepped into the village, the wind carried a hush over the people. Eyes widened, hands froze mid-task, and mouths hung open in disbelief. Women fetching water let their clay pots slip, the dull crash breaking the silence. A child pointed, whispering urgently to his mother. "It cannot be." Someone murmured. "She was lost in the forest," another voice gasped. Yet there she stood, no longer the weak, ragged girl they had cast away. Her shoulders were squared, her posture firm. Her hair, once tangled from neglect, now flowed freely, adorned with beads given to her by the hidden village. Her skin, once pale from hunger, now glowed with strength. And in her palm, the stone pulsed, its light faint yet unmistakable. Confronting the past. Her aunt and uncle emerged from their home, their faces hollow with hardship. They looked thinner, their once proud stance now stooped with exhaustion. It was clear that life had not been kind to them since she had gone. At first, they simply stared. Then, her aunt's voice cracked. "Adia." Adia did not blink. "Yes. I have returned." Her uncle's face twisted, half in shock, half in something else, fear. "But, how?" Adia took a step closer, and those around them moved aside, as if afraid of whatever power she now carried. "You left me to die," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You thought I was a burden. You thought I was bad luck." Her aunt lowered her head, shame burning her cheeks. But her uncle scoffed, though his voice wavered. "You don't understand. We had no choice. Times were hard, we did what we had to." Adia studied him. Even now, he refused to admit his cruelty. Even now, he sought to justify it. "The village has suffered," someone muttered from the crowd. Adia turned to see the village elder, an old woman leaning heavily on a carved staff. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, swept over Adia. "Since the day you were cast out, the rain stopped. The river shrank. The crops failed. No matter how hard we tried, nothing would grow." A murmur ran through the villagers. "It is true," an old farmer agreed. "We thought we were saving ourselves. But it seems we cursed ourselves instead." Adia's heart pounded. Had her exile truly brought this misfortune? Or had it been a lesson from the spirits all along? A sign from the spirits. Before she could speak, the earth trembled slightly beneath their feet. Gasps filled the air as the sky darkened, not with storm clouds, but with something else, something powerful. Then, the first raindrop fell. Then another. And another. The villagers cried out as cool, cleansing rain poured from the sky, drenching the dry earth. The ground, once cracked and lifeless, drank greedily. A single tree in the center of the village, a tree that had stood bare for years, suddenly bloomed, its branches bursting with fresh green leaves. A hush fell. Adia felt the weight of the moment settle deep in her bones. This was no coincidence. The spirits had spoken. She turned back to her aunt and uncle. They were on their knees now, heads bowed, rain soaking their clothes. Her aunt wept silently. "We were wrong," she whispered. "We were so wrong." Her uncle trembled, his hands gripping the wet soil. "Please, forgive us." The entire village waited, holding its breath. Forgiveness or justice? Adia felt the stone in her palm, warm and pulsing with quiet strength. She had every right to punish them. To demand justice. To let them suffer as she had suffered. But then she remembered the old woman's words, "Kindness in darkness brings light." She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "I will not punish you," she said finally. "That is not my place." Her aunt sobbed in relief. "But I will not forget," Adia continued, her voice strong. "You cast me away when I needed you most. You let fear and selfishness rule your hearts. Let this be a lesson, one you never forget." She turned to the villagers. "I have learned the ways of the forest. I have seen what kindness and wisdom can do. If you wish to heal, if you wish to rebuild, you must choose a new way." The elder nodded solemnly. "We will listen, child." Adia exhaled. This was her moment. She had survived the wild, faced spirits and tricksters, found strength where there had once been weakness. And now, she stood before those who had thrown her away, not as a lost girl, but as something more. She was Adia, the girl who had found her way back. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust of hardship, soaking into the cracked earth as if the spirits themselves had offered a second chance. The villagers stood in silent awe, watching the land drink greedily from the sky's gift. Adia felt the weight of her decision settle in her heart. She could have chosen revenge. She could have let anger drive her, let the village suffer as she had suffered. But she was not the same girl they had abandoned. She had learned the ways of the world beyond their borders, had faced trials that had shaped her into something more. She had been given a choice. And she had chosen wisdom. With the storm passing, the village elders gathered before Adia. The eldest woman, her silver hair clinging to her damp skin, stepped forward. "You have returned not as a lost child, but as a guide. The spirits have spoken through you. Tell us, Adia, what must we do?" Adia looked around at the faces before her. Some still held traces of guilt, others hope. And in the eyes of the younger ones, she saw curiosity, the spark of something new. "You must learn," she said. "You have lived too long in fear, casting away what you do not understand. The land, the spirits, the balance between them all, these are not things to take for granted." She turned to the villagers. "I will teach you." And so, in the days that followed, Adia became more than just a girl who had survived, she became a guide, a leader. She taught the villagers the knowledge she had gained in the wilderness. She showed them how to read the signs of the land, when the winds foretold storms, when the rivers warned of drought. She taught them how to find food even in times of scarcity, which plants could heal and which could harm. She spoke of the spirits, of the importance of kindness and respect, of giving as much as they took. The people listened. And, slowly, they changed. As the village flourished under Adia's guidance, the question of her cruel aunt and uncle remained. Some called for their exile, others for a harsher fate. But Adia had already made her choice. Her aunt, filled with shame, withdrew from the others, speaking little, working hard in silence. She became one of the first to take Adia's lessons to heart, tending the crops, helping to heal the land. Over time, she sought forgiveness not just with words, but with actions. Her uncle, however, remained bitter. He could not accept that the girl he had scorned had become something greater than he ever would be. One night, filled with resentment, he tried to flee the village, but the spirits had not forgotten his deeds. He vanished into the forest, and though some searched, he was never seen again. Balance had been restored. With Adia's guidance, the village began to flourish. The rains returned regularly, the fields yielded more than they had in years. The river swelled once more, carrying life through the land. No longer did the people hoard in fear, they worked together, sharing, understanding that the survival of one depended on the survival of all. And Adia? She became more than just another villager. She was their protector, their teacher, their guide. She was the one people turned to for wisdom, the one whose voice carried weight. The elders spoke of her with reverence, and the children ran after her, eager to learn her ways. She never sought power, never claimed leadership. But the people followed her nonetheless. The birth of a legend. Years passed, and Adia's story became more than just memory. It became legend. Mothers told their children of the girl who had been abandoned but found her way back. They spoke of her trials in the forest, of the spirits who had gifted her strength, of her choice to show wisdom instead of vengeance. Her name became a lesson, whispered to every child who felt powerless, to every soul who doubted their own worth. Remember Adia, they would say. She was left in the forest, but she found her way back. And so, her tale lived on, woven into the very fabric of the land, carried in the voices of those who refused to let it be forgotten. A tale of resilience. Of kindness. Of destiny fulfilled. A story, not just of survival, but of a girl who became something greater than fate had intended.